So thank you for coming today, and we're glad that you're able to make it as we discuss the Nigerian election, the outcome of Nigerian election. So we are glad that it has come and gone. During this time of Nigerian, I mean, since last year and early this year, there has been a lot of interest, global interest on this coming Nigerian election. And it is because the success or failure of democracy, rule of law, and ethnic and religious reconciliation in Nigeria is very important, not only for Nigeria, but also for the entire continent. With a population of more than 170, Nigeria is Africa's largest economy and most populous country. The rise of Boko Haram beyond the borders of Nigeria within the global terrorism, where space or boundary does not matter, makes this Nigerian election very critical. Every 4 years since 1999, when Nigeria transited to democratic government, most media, especially in the West, have predicted that the presidential election will break or make the entity called Nigeria. Well, if there is a time this type of prediction has any element of substance, it was during this last election. As I noted in one of my articles on the election, the truth is that a successful and peaceful election depends mainly on whether the two major candidates and their supporters keep their pledges to practice nonviolence during and after the election. The good news is that the presidential election has come and gone, and we thank the current president who graciously considered immediately that immediately, at least now we're not going to have this prediction of doom come to reality. However, we can now say that the Nigerian election was successful and peaceful despite some flashes of violence in some places. But this is not all. We have passed the election process and it came out peacefully. This is just one big hurdle. The challenge now is how the incoming president-elect, Muhammad Buhari, would move the country forward. The economy, infrastructure, poverty, security that include Boko Haram, flashes of violence and ethnic conflict in some parts of the country. So these are the main challenges the country is facing. Also, we wonder what will happen this weekend when the governorship election will take place. Is there going to be peace as the last one had happened? These are the issues our esteemed expert panelists will be discussing today. And we're glad to have our panelists today. First, I introduce Oke Ndibe. Oke Ndibe, like most of you might have known, is a novelist, political commentator, and essayist. He has been very active during this election, writing every week on various papers, and I always tell him that I read more of the comments because of flags he gets for being very critical of both sides, for not being partisan. So we hope he will discuss some of his views on the election and how far things had happened in this panel. Okay, also has just published a book last year. That was, I think, his second book. Is a name called Foreign God Incorporated. We were glad and privileged last semester when we had a discussion on the book. And he's also an assistant professor of Africana Studies, African and Africana literatures here at Brown. So we hope to hear from Oke his view as a Nigerian, how he has seen, how he will critically assess the outcome of the election. And after that, we'll have Paul Darren Q. Unfortunately, he's going to be late because of the traffic. He's coming from Boston. He's on his way. Darren, who is not here now, is an associate professor and chair Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. He's also and the Executive Director of the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development. Q studies the connection between democratic institution building in Africa and the development of political culture that support democracy, particularly in terms of the role of civil society groups in the development. He has worked in the Council of Foreign Relations Center for Preventive Action to provide analysis and blueprint for preventing conflict in several areas around the world, including Nigeria. He has also been a consultant to the United Nations, U.S. State Department, and to a number of NGOs. His work on how conflict resolution methods promote democratization of national political culture is one of the first of its kind, linking these important fields. Q, who is not here, who we're expecting soon, also just came back from Nigeria a few days ago. So he has experience being on the ground, and we hope to hear from him. And the last, not the least, is Paul Lubeck, who we're glad to have, even though it was an emergency. He is a professor emeritus of political sociology, political economy, and development studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Johns Hopkins University. He has decades of experience working in many countries of West Africa, including Nigeria. Lubeck was a corporate agent for the Ministry of Rural Development of the Nigerian Republic. He specializes in Muslim societies. He has conducted research in Niger Republic, Nigeria, Ghana, Mexico, and most recently Malaysia. One of his long-standing research interests focuses on the relationship between globalization process and the Islamic revival in urban industrial states. He has also published extensively on globalization, Islamic social movements, and regional development strategy. We're glad to have Professor Lubeck with us. So we've already taken a few minutes and tried to organize this. So we're a bit late now. So we hope that everybody will stick to their time. The structure is this. 15 minutes for each panelist. We'll speak for 15 minutes so that we have enough time for discussion and comments from the audience. Thank you very much.
All right. Good evening. Okay, we're going to start all over again, and I'll say good evening again. Good evening. Good. Yes. My time hasn't started running. Let me just offer a little bit of cultural education, if you don't mind. We do have here 2 ambassadors who served in Nigeria, and we have, I'm sure, 1 or 2 Nigerians. And you'd know that in Nigeria, you can't, at least in my culture within Nigeria, you can't begin to address any audience without offering a greeting. And if you offer the greeting and you didn't hear back from the audience, that would be their very polite way of saying to you, take a hike. So I usually don't begin to speak until I've offered a greeting and heard back from the audience. So that's why I said, whoa, they want me out of here quickly. So I had to make sure. So my time hasn't started running yet. Yeah, so it's such a delight to be invited to, can you hear me, by the way? Can you all hear me? Okay, good. So this is working, actually. So it's such a delight to be invited at a time as exciting as this one. For me personally, as somebody who has been following and commenting on Nigerian politics and Nigerian culture since 1982. And it's an avocation that has got me into trouble from time to time. And those of you who follow my weekly columns will know that beginning in 2011, the government has been arresting me at the airport on every visit into the country on my way out, because somehow I was put on a list of enemies of the Nigerian state. And so I have a particularly personal and emotional stake in that country, even though, as I told the press secretary to one of the presidents, Yaradua actually, who invited me to come meet Yaradua during one of the visits, Yaradua's only visit to the UN Secretary General conference. And he wrote to me and said, the president considers you a critical stakeholder in the Nigerian project. So he wants to meet with you so that he can discuss his vision for Nigeria with you. And I wrote back and I said, there's no such thing called critical stakeholder. I said, every Nigerian has an equal stake in our country. Every Nigerian has an equal stake. But I'm particularly emotionally drawn to that country because of all the gifts that that country has given to me personally, and also because of my sense, as I continue to say, that Nigeria is a country conceived in hope, but nurtured by its leaders particularly into hopelessness. So it's a country with great potential. And every day the struggle is about how do we reclaim that potential. It's become the case that Nigeria serves in some quarters as a kind of synecdoche for corruption. But Nigeria is not the only corrupt country in the world. It is that Nigeria is one of those prime examples of a political entity whose destiny has been shaped or misshaped by the particularly pernicious and contemptible corruption of its leadership, which corruption has now sort of percolated downward to every sector of the community. And I know this as somebody who in 2001, 2002 was fortunate to get a Fulbright to go teach at the University of Lagos, only to find out that students were offering their bodies and offering cash in exchange for grades. And I found it very, very disheartening, because Nigeria gave me an excellent education. So to find students who have fallen into this level of cynicism to offer their bodies, and when you refused, they began to call me Americana and began to say I was wicked, you know, for not participating in this new economy of just a perversion of academic standards and so on. Anyway, in a lot of ways, I feel like a stranger, even though I'm the only native on the panel. I feel like a bit of a stranger, because I was chatting with Paul a moment ago, and he'd just come back relatively recently from Nigeria. And Darren Q was actually in Nigeria during the elections monitoring things. So I look forward to hearing their immediate eyewitness account of what happened. But I was following things very closely from here. It was clear to me, as clear perhaps as 6 months ago, actually as clear to me as a year ago, when more than 300 kids were abducted in the town of Chibok. And 2 weeks later, the Nigerian president had not addressed that question. And in fact, not only did he not address that question, but some of his aides, including his wife, were suggesting that this was some kind of hoax by the president's political opponents to make him look bad. So as soon as I found out that this man had come to such profound disconnection from the Nigerian people, I knew he was finished politically. Good luck, Jonathan, a man so profoundly misnamed had become bad luck for the Nigerian people.
Good luck to himself.
So I knew that Jonathan was going to lose the election. It was clear to me. But guess what? Nothing was guaranteed, because in the past, by the way, so Nigeria entered history, a different kind of history, on the 28th of March. Became the first time in the country's 55-year history when a serving incumbent president lost an election. Well, that's not the first time the Nigerians voted to remove an incumbent president. It's just the first time that they succeeded. In the past, the incumbent would mobilize all the resources of the state, the military, the police, the secret agency, and also mobilize money, ill-gotten wealth, stolen from the Nigerian people, to sustain themselves in illegitimate power, which was actually the reason that Yar'Adua's press secretary wanted me to meet him. It was clear to me that that Yar'Adua did not win the election that brought him to office in 2007. That his predecessor, Olusegun Obasanjo, who had promised Nigerians that the election of 2007 would be a do-or-die affair, had actually delivered more than he threatened. Rather than do or die, he delivered do and die to Nigerians, and therefore installed an illegitimate, unelected president on Nigerians. And so I announced in my column that as a form of civic resistance to this impunity, I was never going to address Yar'Adua as president. So in my columns, I called him resident of Aso Rock, because after all, that's where he lived. I called him usurper, but I never called him president. And Yar'Adua himself issued a statement where he admitted to irregularities in the electoral process that produced him. And that, ladies and gentlemen, in a country where standards continue to be lowered every day, impressed so many people. So they declared him an honest man. Oh, he's good. He's going to change the country because he admitted to irregularities in his own election. And my point was that the moment he had made that admission, it was therefore his moral duty to renounce the office that he'd been given illegitimately. But Nigerians were just happy. This man admitted it. In the same way, hi Darren, in the same way that lots of Nigerians have begun to celebrate Jonathan. They're going to him a statesman. He's been crowned a statesman. And why is that? Because he lost an election, which he tried to rig, by the way, which he tried to avoid, by the way, but having lost clearly, having been repudiated by the Nigerian people, Jonathan conceded. And so in a country of very low expectations, he's been crowned a statesman. He's been crowned a Democrat par excellence for admitting that he lost. Well, I'm not impressed, especially because of my sense that this man had actually tried to undermine and to thwart the electoral process, the democratic process. Not that I minimize the implications for the country had he chosen not to concede. Nigeria perhaps could have been in a state of war. There would definitely have been widespread violence. So to that extent, I think he made the right step. But I'm not going to call him quite a hero. I'm not going to call him a Democrat. I'm not going to call him my statesman quite yet. Well, I've got into trouble with Nigerians over the last 3 months or so because I've written consistently that I was neither for the PDP nor for APC. And I think that I'm hoping that I'm wrong. I'm hoping that I'm wrong. And what Buhari brings to the table, above all, is his own personal example of self-restraint and discipline. That Buhari has been a military governor, was a military minister in charge of petroleum, which is the most wealthy ministry in Nigeria, and indeed was a military dictator who could steal all the dollars within sight, including much that wasn't in sight. But it's clear to everybody that the man is a man of very, very, very humble means. So how could he have achieved this level of self-discipline? And that, I think, is a particular aspect of the man that resonated with Nigerians. The particular reason that Nigerians then said, this man is the answer. But I'm not sure that he is the answer. And as I've told people consistently, Nigeria has had a history of at least one equally disciplined president, Shehu Shagari. Shehu Shagari, nobody has accused him with any form of evidence that he ever stole money when he was president or before. And yet Shehu Shagari presided over one of the most monumentally corrupt governments in Nigeria's history. So it takes more than personal example. If you bring an angel to run Nigeria as Nigeria is currently constituted, that angel will be quickly corrupted. Okay? And even if that angel isn't immediately corrupted, all kinds of impunity will happen in the name of that angel, despite the sentiment of that angel. And so one hopes that Buhari is going to hit the ground running, and that the way he's going to do this is going to be, in my view, in two different areas. One is that Buhari should show through his appointments that he means business. Buhari has a lot of IOUs that is accumulated from people who funded his campaign. Those people are going to want to put in members into his cabinet whose entire mandate would be to try and steal back on behalf of their sponsors the money that they put into Buhari's campaign. Buhari ought to be able to persuade these sponsors of his to regard the money they put in as perhaps their own contribution to a kind of quasi-renaissance in the country. If Buhari is able to do this, he will be off to a good start. And therefore, what Buhari needs are Nigerians on his cabinet who have two qualities. One quality would be technical expertise. So people you might call technocrats in their different areas. But then to be a technocrat in Nigeria would not be enough. There would also be technocrats who bring ethical funds to the job. Technocrats who would then accept that the proper reward is, in fact, in the success that they achieve in their various departments, rather than in the size of the loot that they're able to accumulate. So that's a sort of what I would call symbolic thing that Buhari has to do. But on a more profound level, Buhari has to commit and perhaps begin the process of the restructuring of Nigeria. Nigeria, as it is today, is an absurdity. Nigeria is a country that doesn't make sense at all. The rave over the last 2 days on the internet is of a video recording as well as audio recordings of the Oba of Lagos, the traditional ruler of Lagos, who summoned so-called Igbo chiefs in Lagos to a meeting 2 or 3 days ago. And he told them that all of you go and organize your people. They must vote for Ambode, Akin Ambode, who is the Oba's choice to be the next governor of the state. And he told them that he went to Mecca and gave people $250,000 to pray for Ambode to be the governor. And that if any of you walk against my candidate, you'll all drown in the lagoon, Lagos Lagoon. And his audience was clapping for him and apologizing to him for voting for candidates who are not the favorites of the Oba. And the Oba is sitting, announcing that this is my kingdom. The throne is not divided. So whoever I want to be the governor of this state, and he says, by the grace of God, is going to be the governor. It's a country that doesn't make sense. Because if it made sense today, that Oba will be in police custody. He'll be undergoing serious questioning by the police. But there are people on the internet, on social media, defending this, saying indeed, the Igbo people have no right to come from the southeastern part of the country and come and change the electoral outcome in Lagos. So when Igbo people who live in Lagos, pay their taxes in Lagos, are not regarded as people in Lagos, and must therefore hitch themselves, their political choices, to that of the Oba, or that of the owners of the land, you see a country that is incoherent, a country that doesn't make sense. And so we need to achieve a country that resembles a nation. We don't have it yet. We don't have it yet. Oh, am I?
Yeah.
I have like 5 minutes, right?
Okay, you can have that.
Huh? Yeah? How long do I have? I have 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, 2 times 2. All right. Okay, so I'm actually gonna, because these are fascinating speakers and I can't wait to listen to what they've got to say. But I'm talking about this restructuring of Nigeria. I'm talking about also to achieve a true federalism in Nigeria, because the competition to get to the center is driven by the fact that that's where the money is. Too much of the money is kept at the center, with too little of the responsibility and too little of the accountability and transparency available in the center. So we have to restructure Nigeria into a true federation. And we actually am a proponent of having every state and every region keep the resources that's produced from their land. So I'm all for the Niger Delta people keeping 100% of the oil that is produced from their land. Okay? And every section in Nigeria has enough people and enough natural resources and enough enterprise to, if people put their minds to it, to achieve themselves and to make a meaningful life for themselves. And there are all kinds of different areas that should be easy to quickly fix. Nigeria has what you call security vote. Security vote hands at least $2.5 million every month to governors of each state. And it sort of mimics, it's inspired by the CIA, which has a covert budget. So the security vote is given to these governors, and they don't, because it's supposed to be for security, they don't explain to anybody what they spend it on. And so every month, every Nigerian governor has $2-point-something million that they can pocket and not account for it. The Nigerian Constitution has the most expansive immunity clauses in all of history. Even if you find a Nigerian governor committing a crime, you cannot try him until after he's stepped down from office. So I tell them, look what happened to Blagovich in Illinois. Just getting on the phone trying to sell Obama's Senate seat got him 14 years in jail. In Nigeria, oh no, that's a scandal. He hasn't committed a crime. In fact, even if he picked up $20 million, they will say you can't try him, he's in office, and you can't touch him until he's finished. Thank you very much. You've been introduced before. They've told them who you are.
Thank you, okay. I was scared that he's not going to stop with his doom story of Nigeria. Well, thank you very much. Quite fascinating for those of you that doesn't have any knowledge of Nigeria, but for me it's like singing the old song. And now we're going to be hearing from Darren Q, who has come. And given that he just arrived from Nigeria, I'm sure he has a lot to say, to tell us. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me here, and my apologies for showing up late and for interrupting. I totally misjudged the traffic coming down from Boston. Thank you again for inviting me. I was an election monitor in Nigeria just the last couple of weeks. I was stationed up in Adamawa State, right near where the Boko Haram territory grab sort of stopped right up about there and just been pushed back. So I'm going to talk about Boko Haram a little bit first in terms of some of the recent developments. I think Paul's going to go more deep into the roots of the movement, and then I'll focus more on the election itself in terms of some of the things we've seen and what maybe some of the longer-term implications are. I think in terms of Boko Haram, so far as it impacts the election, I think maybe a starting place is the interesting point as to how little impact it directly had on the election itself, on what we saw on election day. But of course, it had a greater impact in terms of what led to the build-up to the election and the way the election itself sort of played out on the ground. And I think the starting point for thinking about that is the accusation, and I would argue certainly held out in evidence, that the Jonathan administration had its foot on the brake in terms of going after Boko Haram over the last year and a half or so at least. And I think that this would combine, and this accusation was not just from Nigerian opposition movement and civil society actors. I think Nigeria's neighbors, including Chad and Niger, and even the UN Secretary General made uncharacteristically sort of direct comments that Nigeria had to do more in terms of fighting Boko Haram. And I think this was a resounding message all around, saying that, that the Jonathan administration had not pursued the matter fully. And if you just include the mutinies that were happening on the ground among Nigerian troops over the last year, I counted at least 5. I think that there were more. Certainly shows that within the military as well, there was a tremendous amount of feeling that things were not being done properly. I think that when you add that to a feeling across much of the North that the military approach to Boko Haram was providing an excuse for what many folks would call occupation of the North, a feeling that Boko Haram was providing an excuse for trying to keep the North down, to divide the North, and these sorts of things. In fact, actually, regardless of whether this was true or not, in terms of an effort to occupy the North, the feeling in the North that things were not going their way and that the Jonathan administration was a hostile entity was a very important factor, I think, in the success of the APC in this election, in terms of bringing together northern elites that had been very much divided up until that point. And the elections in 03, 07, and 11, I think, all showed how the sort of the myth of the monolithic North in previous republics had certainly broken down. And 2011 demonstrated that in many, many different ways. So that this sort of sense of external threat provided an important sort of glue for bringing together a lot of different factions in the North that maybe we can talk about in question and answer discussion. And I think it's certainly one story of the success of the APC is its organization itself. There was a masterful, I think, public effort on APC's part to bring out the vote, to organize local institutions, to organize local civil society actors in a way that the PDP just did not do. And talking to a lot of the PDP voters, you know, I think there was 2 things. One, there was a sense on the PDP's part of this belief in the power of the presidency. And I don't think this was just among PDP voters. I think this was very much nationwide, a sense that the president can do what he wants and he's just going to rig in what his solution is anyway. So, you know, why do we need to really show out? But I think there was another factor that was working against the PDP as well, was sort of a general exhaustion on the PDP side of the ledger, in the sense that I think that many of the voters that we ran into felt like the PDP and the Jonathan administration had not delivered on the promises that had been made in 2011. So I think they were in favor, but they just weren't going to go the extra mile. So I think a lot of PDP voters stayed home, whereas the APC, we were seeing, certainly in Kano, we saw something like 60% voter turnout. In the South, in Enugu State, we were seeing maybe 15 to 25% voter turnout. River State was probably less than 15%, although it bumped up to maybe 40% in some of the urban areas. River State, of course, is a special case. Lagos State even saw only about 30% turnout. But in the north, we saw really strong turnout. In Adamawa, where I was, we saw maybe 25 to 45% turnout, depending on the polling station you were going to. Let's say that's around 40% roughly. And as you got further into sort of the pro-Buhari areas, you definitely saw a much larger numbers there. And then, of course, there's the larger sort of religious polarization that was certainly building since 2011. And that the PDP leadership very actively cultivated. There's no doubt that the Jonathan administration was very, very consciously playing the Christian card, particularly in the Middle Belt states. And they did this in 2011 to great effect and worked very well in terms of putting out the vote for PDP at that point. I think this time around it certainly was working in some locales, but generally I think it worked to polarize things even more. And I think that the APC tried to respond as a more sort of broader party, and tried to sort of try to promote a message of, you know, we're more than just a northern party. And of course, having sort of the Tinubu ACN network in the southwest was tremendously important in changing that image and saying that the APC was more of a national party. And I think we saw, you know, even surprising places like Plateau State, which is deeply religiously polarized, where Buhari getting something like, you know, maybe 35 to 40% of the vote. He didn't take Plateau State, but still, that was an amazing outcome. And then, of course, when you look at Benue State and Kogi State, a couple of right there, a little bit further south than we expected, Buhari taking those states was certainly an interesting part of this. Now, an important thing that certainly Boko Haram did provide, and again, I think this provided further justification for this narrative of Boko Haram being at least encouraged, or at least not being gone after with the full force of the Nigerian state, was the delay of the February 14th election, which was precisely the reason given was Boko Haram's military successes on the ground. But then we see this 6-week lightning offensive in which Boko Haram basically folded up like a house of cards. Now, it's not just the Nigerian military. As you probably may or may not have read, the New York Times certainly brought the story out that South African mercenaries played a tremendously important part on the Nigerian side of the border. Meanwhile, you had Chad pushing from one direction, Niger pushing from the other. And so Boko Haram, caught from all around, was pretty well, by within a week of election day, had no territory left under its control. And interestingly enough, this did not seem to work to Jonathan's advantage. In fact, it seemed to play into the hand of those who had the narrative all along of saying, well, this is something was a government creation, or the government's been encouraging them all along, so that's why they've been able to sweep them away in 5 weeks' time. Again, these are narratives on the ground. I'm not necessarily saying that, and I don't believe that Boko Haram is a creation of the government. I think quite the opposite. I think it was a very real movement and still is a very real movement. And I think Paul's going to get more into the details of that. But these perceptions on the ground are tremendously important, and certainly played out in terms of, I think, how the election worked. Boko Haram, I think, at this point has returned to a hit-and-run strategy. We saw attacks in Gombe State on election day itself in 1 or 2 local government areas. There was also some attacks in Borno State. We heard as well of an attack that could have been attributed to Boko Haram in Bauchi State. But these were groups of maybe 20, 30 men on pickup trucks with machine guns sort of pulling into locales, creating sort of a chaos with their attacks, and then sort of melting back into the bush. I think that this is the official reason given, that these are escapees from the last attack on Gwoza, which was the sort of the stronghold of Boko Haram in the northeast, sort of searching out new places to try to establish themselves. And I think we need to probe that a little bit more closely, because over the last 2 years there have been a number of attacks and bombings that have been attributed to Boko Haram that I do not think belong to Boko Haram and are far more connected to local political disputes. So that's something I think we can discuss further in our question and answer. On the election itself, let me just spend my last 5 minutes talking just a little bit about the nuts and bolts of what we saw. And I think, much like 2011, but even better than last time, we saw a really, really excellent process, generally nationwide, on election day itself. And I think a tremendous amount of credit, again, goes to Professor Jega, the head of the Electoral Commission, whose efforts to reform the Electoral Commission have borne some fruit. And most particularly were these the voter card readers, which got a lot of press. We saw, I think, they worked maybe roughly 50, 60, sometimes 70% of the time in terms of the fingerprint component. The part where what you would do is there's a small little machine. You come up with your voter card, you put the card on there, and it tells you yes or no, it is you or not, and then you put your thumbprint on top of it. It was the thumbprinting part that had problems all across the country, but INEC was prepared for that and had people still be able to vote if they just put down their the information, and the INEC staff had a fairly good process for keeping track of that, so that the actual voting on vote day looked pretty good in much of the country. I mentioned that River State was an absolute mess. There were a few other places where there were certainly isolated incidents, and we had individual reports all across the country of ballot stuffing in this polling station here and there. So, certainly by no means a perfect process. I would say that on election day itself, maybe 80 to 85% of the polling units were looking pretty good. But as many of you may know, Nigeria has perhaps the most complicated collation process, where the votes go from the polling station to the ward, to the local government, to the state, and to the federal. And at each one of those collation stations, the political parties have an opportunity to rig, and they tried everything they could to do so. And we saw certainly in Adamawa State in some instances where polling station numbers we saw were at one level the night before, by the following morning had nearly doubled in some areas here and there. So I think there is massive corruption, there is comfortable corruption, and then there's very little corruption. I would say this election falls in the comfortable corruption zone, in the sense that certainly we saw votes changing in many parts of the country in polling units and local government areas, but I don't think that it would have changed the outcome of the election, in the sense that it was clear that this was Buhari's election to lose, and also fairly clearly that the APC balanced out the PDP's vote rigging efforts, sort of rig for rig, and so that there was a balance in this regard, and we should talk about that a little bit later. Let me round up. Yes, we're at the end? Okay. I think that one important thing to mention in the end, and I think this builds on Oke's point as well, that certainly in those last 48 hours, it was by no means certain that the PDP was going to leave without a struggle. We received multiple reports of, first of all, PDP trying to use the judiciary to try to get an order to stop the vote. And supposedly they were not able to find any judges around that were willing to do it. Then they went to the military, and I have this from certainly from several sources, and we're going to see this as well, and then I think it's already in the Nigerian media as well, and that the military itself refused. And I think this is a really important point, because I had heard from some journalists saying that one of the top military brass said, many of the generals and their families from the June 12, 1993 election annulment were pariahs for the rest of their lives. And giving a speech saying, I don't want to be that, and I don't want to do that to my family. And I mentioned this quick vignette only to say that I think there's some important sort of institutional learning that's happening here, that's been happening all along, that I think we need to talk about in our analysis in this discussion. And I don't mean to put the military up as sort of, a saint-like institution. President Buhari is going to have a tremendous amount of work trying to clean up the military. But I think that the fact that the military, that the judiciary, and then the next day, many of you may have seen Orubebe, the former minister of the Niger Delta, going in sort of a buffoonish act of trying to stop the election counting and being basically sort of shown his way out the door as sort of a last-ditch effort, was, I think, a sign of sort of a collective exhaustion with PDP corruption and 16 years of PDP rule. That it wasn't as though there was a conspiracy among all these elements to stop the PDP from doing what it did, but I think rather each one of these areas had said, enough. And I think that was an important sign of sort of both just the impact of the last 16 years, but also some institutional strength that we should talk about. The last point, though, I just wanted to end on is that I think one thing we have to talk about, which may have seemed unthinkable a month ago, is actually the collapse of the PDP. We're already seeing a tremendous amount of members of the PDP crossing carpet over to the APC, and oh, sorry, this is yours. it's my time to go, is going over to the APC, and I actually would argue, and I'm no fan of the PDP, as you may have seen. I think that that would be a bad thing if the PDP completely collapses. Is that what happened in the last 3 years with the rise of the APC, for the first time in the Fourth Republic, is the rise of a viable political opposition. And I think one of the reasons we got such a good election this time is precisely because we had a fairly balanced two-party system going at it. If we go back to 1.5 party rule, maybe we'll have a couple of years of the APC feeling like it's going to have to provide the goods, but I think the APC, many of whom come from the PDP, will return back to the old patterns. And the big turning point in the regional superstars like Ghana and other countries like that, they turn the corner at the rise of a viable political opposition. And hopefully when we see the state level elections this Saturday, we're not going to see the complete washing away of what will soon to be the opposing party, PDP, in some way, shape, or form. And I look forward to talking about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Darren. At least you were able to give us a better outlook of Nigeria. And now, to be frank, if you listen to OK, you will never, ever want to go to Nigeria.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. So now we're going to call, without wasting much time, we're going to call Paul Lubeck to come and give us his own version of the election. Thank you.
Okay. Can I get the slide started? Let's see. Yeah. Could you do that? Yeah. Just set it up so it's the main slide. Yeah. Yeah. And with these. Yeah. That's good. Hi. Well, it's a delight to be here. I was in Nigeria for about 4 weeks in January and early February. I managed to get to the far north in Kano, and the change was palpable. You could feel people think, hey, this election is possible to have an opposition victory. It was fascinating to watch it happen. It's just like democratic theory says it's supposed to happen, right? So that it's an enormous pleasure for me to be here. I've been here before, partially because I am pleased to have two of my students here in different generations, with Patrick Heller and Jamie McPike, who have both worked with me at UC Santa Cruz, and it's a pleasure to be back. So what I want to do is talk about the challenges for Buhari and democratic rule, and in the north, right? Find out how to work this. Let's see. Good. Okay, so for people who've been, many of you, it's unlikely you know all the categories that we have been using here. So this is a map from the previous election. These are the far north Sharia states that voted for Sharia law, because Boko Haram is a Sharia movement to implement true Sharia law. Between 2000 and 2003, these states voted to reintroduce a form of Sharia law that was subordinated to the Nigerian judicial system. This is the old northern region here. All right, so about 73 to 78% of Nigeria is the north. And the argument I want to put forward today is that Boko Haram is really a response to the enormous crisis of the north, the political crisis, the economic crisis, a religious crisis, and the enormous conflict that is driving Boko Haram. So the meaning of Boko Haram is important. So haram is something that's forbidden in Arabic. It's haram in English as a forbidden area. Boko means deceptively inauthentic. Deceptively inauthentic education and lifestyle. It's a measure of the power of the ulama, the religious teachers, and the what I would call Sharia-minded elites in northern Nigeria. This was all part of an empire in the 19th century at Sokoto, where they managed to label Western education and Western culture as deceptively inauthentic. So the elites themselves are considered to be deceptively inauthentic by many members of the North. Let's see. So, okay, that's all right. Technology, yes, okay. So let me just try to, summarize where I want to sort of take this. That I think Buhari faces a challenge with Boko Haram, and we have to think about what exactly is Boko Haram. So one aspect of Boko Haram is that it's a Salafist sect, meaning a sect that's extremely puritanical, literal readings of the Quran, in this case derived largely from Saudi funding and support. This is this reformist discourse that has marginalized mystical brotherhoods called Sufi brotherhoods and introduced a high degree of intolerance in northern Nigeria, and they practice takfir, the declaration that Muslims who do not meet their standard are apostates. This was done by the elites. A man named Gumi in 1978 declared all members of one particular brotherhood to be apostates. So Boko Haram emerges under a man named Muhammad Yusuf, who was a Quranic school teacher, no Western education, who set up an enclave in the city of Maiduguri and managed to get the support of the governor. The governor used his followers as thugs. His name is Modu Sharif. From about 2003 to 2007, they later had a falling out, but he appointed one of Muhammad Yusuf's followers as Commissioner of Religious Affairs to show you the relationship of the elites with Boko Haram. So their vision then is the restoration of a golden age in the 19th century where they had Sharia law and tied up with international support from Saudi Arabia and other groups. I mentioned this word takfir, means to declare people who are don't meet Salafist standards to be apostate. That's one whole cultural wave that's very powerful in northern Nigeria and throughout the Muslim world. The second dimension, a way to understand Boko Haram, is that this is a youth-driven rebellion against the Yan Boko, the people who dominate them, who rule them, who get access to petroleum rents. And the term Yan Boko means the people who have Boko, who dominate and consume resources with massive inequality, live in palatial houses with razor wire circulating around it while other people live in mud hovels. The Western educated politicians, merchants, and the privileged groups. Now what's driving this social movement, rebellion against the Yan Boko, is a vast demographic explosion going on in northern Nigeria that I'll provide some data for if we have time. The third dimension of this, these are sequential. It starts as a Salafist sect. It emerges as a rebellious movement until about 2010, 2012. They did not attack. They were attacking security forces. There were certainly people being killed, but there were many examples where they told people to avoid bombs and avoid damage. They used suicide bombers by 2012. By 2013, for certain, they've degraded into what I would call gangster jihadis. A movement degrades into criminal gangs committing atrocities, nihilist cruelty, slitting the throats of school children, enslavement of girls, all these things that bring back our girls, Dash, Bring Back Our Girls, brought to our attention last year. They've seized territory in the Northeast, and they've declared it an Islamic state of some kind, roughly all the territory the size of Maryland, and finally they joined ISIS. And it's pretty clear they've joined ISIS. So this is an enormous transformation of a movement that began as a reform movement. So Buhari and what I think is a reform government has to deal with these issues. So if you take a look at it's in the opposite sequence that I gave you, the problem of gangster jihadis and the insurgency. He has to rebuild state institutions. He has to rebuild the army. The army suffers from enormous corruption. Darren mentioned these are white South African mercenaries who fought for apartheid that were brought in. So the army is extremely weak, and Buhari has to rebuild it. He also has to provide governance in a region that has lost local government or state government in the 3 states of the Northeast. And there are geographical challenges, which I'll show you on when we finish this. The second is on the movement of youths. They're demanding livelihoods and a way to live, and I want to look at the demographic crisis and suggest some regional economic development. Buhari's come out for a Marshall Plan, but there needs to be some sort of organization or institution that'll implement the Marshall Plan. The World Bank was invented to implement the Marshall Plan in Western Europe after World War II, and there needs to be infrastructural investments in the North, power, water, transport. Lastly, going back to the Salafist sects, there needs to be a reconsideration of the intolerance of takfir and as a core element in the involution of the North, where they failed to acknowledge citizenship of other Nigerians. There needs to be a discussion of whether they can participate in what I would call Muslim modernity, like Malaysia and Indonesia, where the elites send their children. This is a whole set of issues that only the Muslims can deal with, but I want to raise them here. And they've got to deal with institutionalizing and educating around 10 million poor children that are in Quranic schools, right? All right, so this is a slide where it just gives you a summary of the different elements in Boko Haram. And the broadest, there's sympathy for Boko Haram's vision of living under Sharia law because of the enormous corruption and the failure of the transfer of Western institutions. This election shows that it is possible to have a democratic outcome, at least in the minds of the majority of the Northerners. And we go through, if we have time, to talk about the different elements who have joined up with Boko Haram. Another important issue that's driving this is the demographic explosion of northern Nigeria. Unless they deal with the enormous population increase, the average woman in the Sharia states that I showed you on the map has between 7 and 7.4 children. Right? The population growth rate's over 3%, and that automatically leads to lower per capita incomes, more misery. Health and education budgets cannot meet these demands, and the trend if the current trends continue, it guarantees waves of urban youths in cities, and if it's not Boko Haram, it'll be different extremist groups. Lastly, as we look at this data, I'll show you, there must be the increased funding of girls' education and raising the status of girls for a whole series of reasons. That's the only way to really deal with the rise in population in the North. So here's the difference of the North that gives the data. You have 7.3 to 7.2 in the far North, the Southwest 4.5. Right? Enormous differences. Now Nigerians have an investment in northern recovery because this is going to change the population religious ratios that are roughly equal in Nigeria. So southern Nigerians have an interest in northern recovery. Here's an example of what youth early marriage produces. Women, girls between 15 and 19. This gives you ratios who are pregnant or already have a child, all part of the demographic explosion that is driving Boko Haram. It only takes a small number of these large populations to join extremist groups for them to be disruptive. 4 people killed about 160 Kenyans this last weekend. All right, here's the data for the problem on education and backwardness that is a problem that Buhari must deal with. And another is more on secondary school. Here's more data on educational standards in the north. Now there's the good news. It's possible for northern women to engage in educational activities and to take charge of their own earnings. This is a survey that from the Demographic and Health Survey, the best survey in Nigeria, and it shows that northern women, northern Muslim women, have greater control over their own incomes, and this needs to be encouraged, and you can see a way to recover Nigerian, raise the incomes of women by building on this indigenous tradition. Now, poverty is enormously widespread in the north. Here's some data on that. And now this leads to malnutrition, poverty. So this is part of the reason why Buhari is calling for a Marshall Plan for the north, because of these living standards. Now, there are possibilities for the north, and what I'm arguing here is for the importance of regional development agencies to produce food for the south. Meat grows, the price of meat increases by 8% a year in southern Nigeria. We have higher incomes, and almost all of it comes from the north. The possibilities of the north to develop agro-industrial linkages is very high. I'll show you some maps. The Buhari will be challenged to develop infrastructures to be able to make this possible, but I believe it is possible. There needs to be a focus on the facilitative state, not a state that owns industries, but facilitates cooperation between private and public investors. The governor of Kano, Kwankwaso, has been very successful and is truly developmental in the East Asian, Southeast Asian sense of a developmental governor. There needs to be what I would call regional development authorities to coordinate and promote industrial development in the north. So this is the axis here. For the north, you have Kano, the second largest city in Nigeria. In this area here, Kano, Zaria, Kaduna, offers the possibility of high densities, many universities, investments in industries, and then in this whole area here, you have vast irrigation and water, despite a semi-arid region. This is some of the irrigation system that all flows to Lake Chad. Here's another shot of it that shows the potential of the region. And here's more. Okay, so these development agencies, I won't go on because of time, but there's some summaries of the way these development agencies can make a difference in the north. This is a good example of one of the major industries in Nigeria, the leather industry. It's the second largest foreign exchange earner. The industries that are thriving in Kano are 5 international tanneries with some smaller ones. They need to develop linkages with the east where there's shoes, leather, garment industry, and they'd be able to participate in this. Another slide on the importance of these industrial linkages. So I don't think it needs to be a narrative of despair in the north with Boko Haram. I think Boko Haram is defeatable, but there needs to be a strategy for requiring industrial investments to give people hope that would enable Buhari to be able to reestablish governance in the northern regions and the Northeast, and at the same time to be able to promote livelihoods. Thank you very much.
We thank Professor Lubeck for being able to give us this detailed analysis on how to move things forward, especially in the northern part of the country. I know some of you might have some questions and comments, so I'll open the floor now for questions and comments, please. Please make it very brief so that many people will have the opportunity to ask their question and make their comments.
Possibly related acute crises related to the finances of the Nigerian state. The first being the theft of billions of dollars in oil that the then central bank governor had reported. And the other is the huge devaluation of the naira and associated fallen reserves. So what is possible in that kind of acute fiscal situation?
Let me just collect, I think it's better we collect a few questions, about 3 questions, and you respond.
Actually, I have just a question for them down the middle. You said you were invited, you were a poll watcher?
Observer.
I was wondering which organization you were and like how it came to that, why they allowed you to come in, or was it something that you kind of like forced your way in, or something that you were invited in, and maybe you could talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interested in the comments on how you think Buhari might change the security posture against Boko Haram. In particular, the conference that's been called on the 8th in Equatorial Guinea of all the leaders. If you expect a different kind of posture coming from the now lame Jonathan administration, or what kind of pivot we might see from Buhari. Thank you.
Okay, one more question from Peter.
I want to push back a little bit on the federal versus
State.
decentralization argument. There's a bit of a tension. I mean, clearly for legitimacy purposes, having more genuine forms of provincial or federal, state level governance plus subnational governments makes a lot of sense, building local states and regional planning capacity, et cetera. On the other hand, the money is all at the center and in the South, and so if the program is a Marshall Plan for the North with the politics of redirecting wealth from the South to the North, then what are the entrenched interests that would oppose that? And then I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the social base and the geographical base of the winning coalition. Who actually, what were these majorities, how they were constructed, in addition to the policy question? Are there regional, class, and community patterns that emerge? Is there any good data on who voted and what the alignments were?
Okay. I don't,
All right.
can start.
In terms of policy differences, that's one of the questions that I kept raising in column after column, that the issue became Jonathan's ineptitude and incompetence. And so the PDP basically was saying, you know, we're a wide umbrella, you know, you need to come under the umbrella, which is the symbol of the PDP. And the APC said, we're the broom, you know, we're going to sweep up the PDP. And so Nigeria had this kind of conceptual, what I call a kind of conceptual lacuna, where people were promising things, you know, Buhari, Nigerians just took it on faith that Buhari is going to address the problem of corruption. But Buhari doesn't spell out how he's going to do that, right? And the devil is in the detail. Nigerians trust that since Buhari ran a military regime that pursued a war against indiscipline, that Buhari has the wherewithal to handle corruption. And corruption has seeped into every sector in very profound ways. So Buhari can do something about corruption, but he has to begin quickly to give us those answers. So I don't think that those answers have shown up in at least in a clear enough pattern for people to say, to have the confidence. The other question you raised about money, Nigeria has a huge cash crisis. In fact, in December, for the first time in many, many years, the federal government was not able to pay salaries. As of December, a lot of civil servants went home without collecting their November pay. Jonathan later said that what had happened was that the government was actually cleaning up the system and picking out ghost workers, and so that the computer somehow then stopped the payment of some people's salaries. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. But you have a situation where the former central bank governor says that $20 billion of oil revenues had not been accounted for. The finance minister then says it's only 10 billion that is not accounted for. Then they appoint an auditor and promise that within a month a report will be in. It took several months. And without Nigerians seeing the report, suddenly we hear that the auditors found a gap of 1.8 billion, right? Any of those three figures, for me, should bring the country to a halt, okay? And people should be going to jail immediately, not later, But there's a country where 1.8 billion is only, 10 billion is only, and yet the vast majority of citizens live on $1 a day, you see. So the federal, of course, we need to address part of the point that Paul was making, right, is that Boko Haram is driven by this great hostility to Western education. And yet the answer is indeed more Western education, because you have these kids who have gone to Islamic schools, and therefore they don't have the tools to participate in modernity, if you like. And yet they turn around and they say, look at all the young people who have all the posh homes and cars and so on. So this is decadence. This is Western decadence. There's, of course, a lot of corruption. But in fact, the opportunity at all to even play the lottery of corruption begins with your access to Western education. So what you need is more Western education, not less. And so Buhari has to do, not Buhari, by the way, Nigeria has to do a lot more to address the issues of economic impoverishment. But that narrative is a global Nigerian narrative. There's no part of Nigeria where people are doing well. There are parts of Nigeria where people are doing relatively better. But it is, on the whole, a bleak picture. I have a younger brother who has a master's degree in architecture and in an MBA, and he's not had a job in 15 years. At some point, he got a vehicle and he was a cab driver. And this is not an untypical narrative. This is the story of lots and lots of young people, because, the naira, the value of the naira just went south quickly, because the politicians did what? They cleaned up all the dollars available, because the going currency for buying political favor is now the dollar. And this started actually when the parties were doing their primaries. All the candidates bribed the delegates with dollars, to get the votes. And so so every part of the economy is deeply, deeply affected. I mean, I know that there are so many questions, I forget some of them. So let me,
Please,
okay. Let me the policy divide question and the last question about the basis of the coalition, I think, are similar. So I'll try to touch on that first. I think certainly the unifying factor in the APC is the anti-corruption component of Buhari, but I think more so it's primarily an anti-PDP coalition. So it brings together a lot of strange bedfellows that I don't think, and it will be interesting over the next couple of years to see how those cracks within the ruling party play out. The APC at its inception is nothing more than a razor-thin handshake between Buhari and former Governor Tinubu of Lagos State, who is really sort of the leading force in the old Southwestern Party, the ACN. The ACN, I think, the core has more of a social progressive ideological. Certainly, some of the governors there have far more of a social progressive ideological orientation. I think Buhari himself tends to be more on the conservative side, and his party, his old party structure, sorry, the CPC, certainly was far more of a structure just around him personally, in terms of rather than having a ideological orientation. I think it attracted some of the old northern progressive components to the coalition, certainly in the sort of the central corridor that Paul was talking about. I think in the other parts of the North, however, I think it has a lot of very conservative elements of the North, and I think those contradictions, which President Jonathan played very well in the 2011 election, are certainly still going to be there in 2019 as well, and will be interesting to see how that develops from here on in. Really quickly on President Buhari's security policy on Boko Haram, it's interesting that really the very first policy speech he made after being elected was on Boko Haram and promising a heavy hand to deal with the insurgency. But talking to some of his security advisors, there's going to be a military component to this, there's no doubt about it. But it's interesting they've been using the language of human security as well in terms of their response. And I think a lot of the sort of the message that Paul and others have been sending about the economic component of the crisis has reached those ears. And I think we're going to see sort of a broader a DDR sort of demobilization effort is going to be done with a big portion of the movement that they can work with, and some sort of larger economic initiative. Lastly, on being an observer, Nigeria itself invites international observers. I mean, the biggest observer contingent, of course, are the Nigerian domestic observers, and I think the internationals were there primarily to try to sort of to provide a backup to that and to provide a little bit of international objectivity, I suppose would be the word. Although I think we can talk about observation itself has certain strengths and weaknesses. But I went with NDI, the National Democratic Institute. They asked me to be on the team, and we had about 20 observers. The Republicans had about 15 observers there. The African Union was there. Let's see, there was the European Union probably had the biggest observer corps. And so altogether, we had most of the states covered. But it was really the Nigerian domestic observers who had certainly the strongest contingency on the ground, and I think gave the best reports.
Let me pick up on some of the questions. I don't believe that this was the Immaculate Conception, and I'm not expecting it. Right? I only think that the virgin birth occurred once, right? So that this is more like a coalition that is like the Democratic Party in 1950. Just think what the Democratic Party was like in it was not pretty. Was it a democracy? Well, probably, maybe, we could debate that. It wasn't a democracy for me until 68, but for others. So but this is, I don't want to I'm concerned about actually a narrative of pessimism, because this is a major achievement of civil society and the ability of people to coalesce and cooperate to get rid of an incredibly incompetent and corrupt regime. Now, everyone has been more corrupt personally than Buhari. And the military generals all the way through Abacha. We're still trying to calculate how much his family and himself stole. Obasanjo attempted to change the Constitution for a third term, spent $1 billion. They took the money and then voted against him. So that Buhari is personally not corrupt, but the question is whether he's capable of institutionalizing his personal ethic into institutions. So I think that's the big question. Since I tend to be optimistic, I'm buoyed by the success of Fashola and the APC in the Southwest, and the people in the Southwest are known for education and technocracy, and Fashola claims he raises 70% of his revenues from local sources. Now it's Lagos, 20 million people in a commercial center, but that's certainly promising. The question on oil and rents, where is it coming from? If you talk to the APC, they say the system is so astonishingly corrupt right now. Now you have a lobby of people that have licenses to import refined product, and they have 800,000 barrel a day capacity, 600,000 barrel a day capacity. So if the international price is $3 and the local price is $1, they get to go to the bank and claim they imported massive amounts of petroleum and get $2 for every barrel, every gallon they claim they imported. That is the sewer that funds the system, and I know that that's a target of the reformers. It would be, and my own personal, I don't think Nigeria has the institutional capacity to manage these regimes. It would be better to have world market prices. And now the price of oil is so low, it makes sense to do it. And then the other person that's playing a role here is the wealthiest man in Africa. Indeed, the wealthiest man in Nigeria is Aliko Dangote from Kano, from the north. So the entrepreneurship is represented, and he's proposing to refine 400,000 barrels a day on a free trade zone so he can avoid the government in Lagos. And he's got an $11 billion schema of loans headed by Charter Bank of South Africa. So there's truly a possibility, as people know, I am for the capitalist road in Nigeria, and I'm a man of the left, but institutionally Nigeria, there never was a more feral marriage than Fabian socialism and the Nigerian personality, right? It's just hopeless. So I think we need to forget about that. The other issue on the federal state indigeneity, I hold the view, and OK came out for the importance of local interest. I think that the citizenship of Nigerians needs to be elevated. And there needs to be a commitment to citizenship rights, not solely indigenous identity rights. And I think that that is part of the achievement of this election, because people, in many cases, women, if they're outside their region, lack opportunities for employment, and if they're not, if they're living in the state of their husband. The other question on the insurgency, Darren's friend Abdul Rahman Dumbazal is the security advisor for Buhari. He has a PhD in sociology, among others, so that's an important thing for a sociologist like me. And he's somebody I know, and I have a great deal of respect for him. I think they're going to try to, you have to understand that people are in Boko Haram because they need the money, right? They're being paid for this, and Quranic students are being paid as informants to watch the military and things like this, so that there's the class is an economy of insurrection that's part of this movement, despite its enormous brutality and that we've talked about. So the question on the schools, Hamidou Boboye is a historian that's attempting to convince the world that the way to deal with the Quranic students and the hostility to Western education is to create Muslim modern schools. They have them in Malaysia, they have them in Indonesia, and to mix like Catholic schools, like Christian schools, whatever schools in the world, that would be part of the solution. Where's the money going to come from? The amount of theft can be, if that can be reduced, that's part of the source. And lastly, the World Bank, and documents I've read, is beginning a major study and a promotion of northern Nigeria because of the fear of destabilizing the whole region of West Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our time is almost a bit. We'll collect one round of questions, and please make it very brief, and also the respond brief. More questions? Yeah.
So one thing that has always struck me is the similarities between groups like Boko Haram and other militant groups in Nigeria, so groups in the Niger Delta, for example, and the dominant narratives about these groups, right? So in the Niger Delta, you have former Governor Peter Odili has this supposed alliance with Asari Kubo to win the elections. Then there's a falling out after the elections, and then things really start to heat up, right? And there's a similar narrative about what happens with Boko Haram, right? So former Governor Ali Mohamed Sharif makes this alliance with Muhammad Yusuf to oust former Governor Kala Machala in the 2003 elections, and he's successful, and he does. And then over time, there's, again, a falling out, right? But then there's different trajectories of these groups, too. So I've always kind of wondered about the similarities between these groups, and then why do they take different trajectories? Is it because there's a massive crackdown on Boko Haram in 2009? Muhammad Yusuf is killed, 800 members are killed. There's an amnesty program for the Niger Delta militants in 2009. So maybe there's something there about the government's response, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on these different militant groups that we've seen in Nigeria.
One more, 2 questions, please.
We talk about combating Boko Haram in the north, but how can, we talked about 3 different ways, I think civic, economic, and militarily, but how do you combat a group like Boko Haram when you can't police corruption within the government, you can't use the military or local law enforcement to secure the pipelines, to secure local resources? How do you go about combating an organization as organized and as powerful as Boko Haram?
Any more questions? Okay, I think that will be the last set of questions. And please
Do you
make
want
it
to start
brief.
from there this
Yes,
time?
Okay.
please.
All right, so there are similarities because of the, I don't think you have the demographic engine in the Delta. And in the Delta, there was one thing they wanted, which was more. Right? There was no known ideology. Right? There's no international network. Right? They're not joining the EJAW are not capable of IS type of connection. So I think that's a major difference. There's also a large social base in northern Nigeria that is Sharia minded. It's a past regime to do it. So that's a major, there's similarities, but there are also really significant differences on that. Michael Watts has a paper where he talks about it and rambles along in Michael Watts style if you want to look at it. If you Google around, you'll find it, and he'll come up and do it. How to combat, they've been able to clean out areas of Kano by organizing communities and everyone. I'm in Washington now, right? I'm in the center of its counterinsurgency. It's one of the major industries in Washington, right? So everybody knows how to do it. I'm supervising a dissertation in somebody in Santa Cruz who's doing a critique of it. Technically, everybody knows how to do it. The problem is getting civil society groups and enough solidarity within the communities to be able to support that. And there are a lot of examples of them cleaning out Boko Haram. The whole western part of Hausaland has almost no Boko Haram. You can go to Sokoto, walk around. You have to. It's a big difference.
In terms of the similarities, I guess one thing I would add maybe about the sort of the Niger Delta militias is although it's definitely very much a sort of an economic focus, in its inception it certainly did have an anti-state ideology to it, and a lot of what became militias were very much connected to student movements from the 1990s, and certainly had a strong sense of anti-statism to it. And with the goal of sort of local resource control and a developmentalist ethic to it. And the anti-state component certainly is very similar, and certainly the rhetoric of MEND and some of the other Niger Delta militias is eerily reminiscent of things that Boko Haram says as well, in terms of just the criticism of the Nigerian state that they both put out there is certainly very similar. And I think also, too, they do share the sort of political embeddedness that you're talking about. And Paul mentioned is certainly how locally connected Boko Haram was up until 2009, certainly having one of the state commissioners coming from Boko Haram and having other connections there. I had heard in 2010 that certainly they still had connections in the federal government as well. And President Jonathan himself at one point, publicly stated that there were Boko Haram members in his own government. I think this was in late 2011, early 2012 at that point. So, there's certainly the sort of political relationships, and obviously, as you've mentioned as well, the Niger Delta militias are deeply sort of hand in glove with the local political establishment. And I think one of the interesting things we'll be seeing is, I think we've talked a little bit about how Buhari is going to deal with Boko Haram. He's going to have to turn as well to the Niger Delta militias. And what the amnesty package ends in June, so just several weeks after he takes office. What's he going to do about that? I mean, I think the smoke signals they're sending is that we're going to continue the amnesty package, they say, but it's going to be in a very different form. It's not going to be the cash handouts. It's going to be a real sort of DDR package of demobilization, and again, sort of looking wider. But I think, we've already heard rumors of some of the militias saying that they're going to try to make the next 4 years ungovernable. Mend endorsed Buhari and then endorsed Jonathan, and now is saying, we're friends with with Buhari again, and even Asari himself, who I don't think represents anyone at this point but himself, saying there was Asari before Jonathan, there will be Asari after Jonathan. So basically saying he's up for connections as well. So I think there's going to be this ongoing bargaining phase we're going to see over the next 6 to 12 months, where I think the Buhari administration is going to focus first on finishing off Boko Haram, which I think, as you mentioned, is going to have to involve certainly a period of military reform itself. I mean, as Paul mentioned, I mean, it seems all but clear it's really the South African mercenaries that spearheaded the counteroffensive. It's the military is going to have to be reformed. It's going to have to be put back onto a real capacity where it can manage these things, and that's going to take some time. And just as that goes forward, these old patterns of corruption are certainly going to continue to be playing out. And so it's going to be certainly a murky picture over the next 6 to 12 months.
Well, wow. In my culture, I could actually say that I adopt their responses, but I won't be a true son of my father, so I'm going to say a few words. It's interesting, the question that you raised, because the interesting tracks, the ways in which the narratives of Boko Haram and narrative of MEND intersect, very interesting, right? So here was Peter Odili and a few other governors in what's called the South-South. It's a uniquely Nigerian designation, South-South, So these politicians used a lot of young men who were otherwise disenfranchised, but who had guns, used them to win political power. But it's in the nature of politicians, once they are ensconced in power, to forget these rascals. You don't want these young men haunting your parties and so on. And so they're ignored, but they still have their guns. So what did they do? They began to target oil pipelines. They began to kidnap oil workers and expatriates and so on. And began to build, because of course then the Nigerian government under Obasanjo had the military response. Let's send the warships and, after them and so on. And instead of really subduing these militants, what it did was that it actually fertilized that entire industry of violence. But the other part of the narrative is that, as both Darren and Paul said, there was always, especially after Ken Saro-Wiwa was hanged by military regimes, Ken Saro-Wiwa was using the non-violent, approach to say we need this entire paradox that the region in Nigeria that produces the oil is the most economically depressed region. So Ken Saro-Wiwa said no. And then he says, we need actually control of our resources, right? the Nigerian government hangs him and believes we've solved the problem. Instead of which, when the Asaris and the, what's his name, Tom Polo and the rest of them come up, they say, wow, these people killed Kensaro, who was critiquing the Nigerian system and this injustice through using political platforms. So we're going to respond with violence, which is what ultimately led to the Nigerian government saying, okay, let's talk. What can we give you? And some of those young men and women have become billionaires, right? Some of them, Tampolo, I understand now, has a private jet or two, right? So the same thing you find in Boko Haram, you know, so Mohammed Yusuf, you know, comes up after a theological break with another sort of mainstream pastor, you know, so he starts this fringe sect where he's telling his followers, you know, that the system is Western education, that the problem, the malaise of the country and that of their region and the cause of their problems is, you know, this system that is based on Western education. So we have to repudiate it, we have to reject it, we have to uproot it. And then, but in doing all of this, he's again collaborating with Sharif, right? But when Sharif, you know, gets into office, he begins increasingly to ignore the group again, which leads to a deepening of the militarization in that group. And of course, when they have a quarrel with, you know, security agencies, what do? They arrest Yusuf, hand him over to the police. 2 hours later, the police said, oh, he died, a man whose hands were tied behind his back, shown in a press conference. And suddenly the police say he died in an exchange of gunfire with them, right? And it's the typical reasoning of the Nigerian state. If we kill this man, the problem is going to disappear. Instead of which the system, for those who are following this man, they said, wow, the only logic the Nigerian system is going to understand is violence, because that's the system that it dispenses. And so we have a problem now where how do you negotiate with a group where people believe that what they are doing, that when they explode themselves, that what they are doing is somehow a holy duty? How do you negotiate with them? How do you negotiate with sexually frustrated young men who believe that if they die in the process of killing strangers, that they are going to go to paradise and have 72 virgins? Okay? Of course, the whole question that you're going to spend eternity and all you get is 72 virgins, you know, the absurdity of it. But this is what you are up against. This is what you're dealing with. And so I'm not quite sure. You raised the question about Boko Haram and it's been organized. I'm not quite sure that Boko Haram is organized as much as it is that the Nigerian state is deliberately disorganized. What happened, as Darren sketched out in his presentation, what happened is that we saw the Nigerian military say, with Jonathan say, give us 5 weeks or 6 weeks and we're going to dislodge Boko Haram. And they did. So as I tell people, this ought to tell us that the Nigerian state is organized around the principle of doing no work, okay? Just pocketing the resources of the country. When the election was on the line and Jonathan saw that he was losing it, and the military brass knew that they would prefer a Jonathan and his ineptitude, because every year Jonathan had a budget of about $5 billion to fight Boko Haram, and yet the country was not acquiring the weaponry. That means that some people, because that money was spent, it was in some people's pockets. So if they were going to continue to have access to that money, Jonathan had to remain in office. So they said, wow, let's do a job so that we can get Jonathan reelected. But I think at that point, Nigerians said, whoa, so you could do this all along, but for 2 to 3 years, you did nothing. And you let this, I mean, imagine it. Boko Haram took 300 schoolgirls in Borno State at midnight in a state where there was a state of emergency, in which after 8 p.m., no vehicles except for military and security vehicles were supposed to be on the road. How could this happen? That's because there was organized disorganization. So I don't give Boko Haram that much credit. And we've seen the way they folded up in the last 5 to 6 weeks as evidence that they really are not as organized as we give them credit. It's just that the Nigerian military combating them saw that there was profit in letting Boko Haram win for a long time.
Patricia doesn't seem to agree, but
Oh, you don't agree?
No, I actually agree.
Patricia
I do.
thinks that I'm negative, by the way.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
the most positive guy in the world.
Okay is not negative, but
Yeah.
when it comes to Nigeria,
I'm
and with that
hyper-positive.
note, I think, you know, if we were speaking about the politics or the election or Boko Haram, it's very, very complex. I just came back from Nigeria regarding that. So we'll continue the conversation outside as we have some refreshment. Thank you all for coming. We do appreciate it, and thank you, our panelists. It has been a very, very refreshing time.